Hello, I'm Neil Mackenzie, a professional wine merchant and wine expert, and I'm here to guide you through your wine pack that you've recently purchased. In this wine pack, you'll also find details of how to actually buy these wines should you want to perhaps use them for further study. So without further ado, let's get started. The property that I've followed for many years is Chateau Beaumont, which I'm going to taste with you now. Chateau Beaumont is a wine from Bordeaux. It's from the Haut Medoc, which is a region on the left-hand side of the Gironde estuary in Bordeaux. As you know, on the right-hand side you have Emilion and Pomerol. On the left-hand side you have the great big region of Medoc, but within that you have this smaller Haut Medoc region, the higher ground, which is where, of course, we find these famous communes like Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien and Margaux. But situated between Saint-Julien and Margaux, we have this property. And Chateau Beaumont has been around for quite a while. The chateau was actually built in 1654, but they've been making wines on this site from vineyards around about 1823. Like all Medoc wines, they tend to be more Cabernet Sauvignon than Merlot. Partly because of the gravel soils. Gravel soils like to allow Cabernet Sauvignon to have their roots nice and dry, and of course the gravel allows the water to drain away. Having said that, there is actually a lot more Merlot produced in the Medoc than you imagine, and I'll explain that later. But first of all, let's look at the wine. Chateau Beaumont, Haut Medoc. I think we're going to enjoy this one. Colour, very, very deep in the glass, that lovely opaque, classic Bordeaux colour. And on the nose, cassis, black currant, bit of cherry there as well. That's really super, that really is. And on the palate, quite consuming, it really is. It's got a big, powerful palate. Lovely juicy fruit flavours. My mouth is watering. There's lovely crisp acidity there as well. And the flavour really goes on to the end. That's a lovely wine. This will be around for a few more years yet, I can assure you. Chateau Beaumont really perhaps shows you how good Cru Bourgeois can be. And this is a Cru Bourgeois. What does that mean? Well, back in 1855, the wine market in France was absolute chaos. Nobody knew what to charge for these wines. You had wines that people knew were very good and fetching high prices, but there was no real order in these wines. You had the big wines like Latour and Lafite and Margaux all fetching great prices, but there was no real order to the market. So they came up with the Cru Classé system. And basically what it meant was you had 5 divisions. In the top division, or the first growths, you had 4 wines. Margaux, Lafite, Latour and Haut, just to the south of Bordeaux in the Graves region. And then you had the second growths, like Cos d'Estenel, third growths, fourth growths and fifth growths. All great wines, but all layered in this divisional status. And then those that hadn't quite made the 5th growth were called Cru Bourgeois, and this is what we're drinking. However, over the last 170 years, things have changed somewhat, and I do think the system is somewhat outdated. There are some great Cru Bourgeois on the market, wines like this one, and indeed Chateau or Chaspleen, that I think really deserve to perhaps get accorded a 5th or even 4th growth status. Lovely wines. And maybe the other way around, there are some wines up there that shouldn't really be given the status they have. But anyway, that's for another day. Now, I mentioned earlier that Merlot is actually the predominant grape variety in the Medoc. Everyone thinks that Merlot is just the home of in Saint-Emilion and in Pomerol, but indeed it is grown quite widely in the Medoc. And the reason being that in the Medoc it's not just gravel soils, but a lot of clay soil as well. And Merlot likes to have its roots nice and damp. And of course with clay soils, that's what you get. And the further south in the Medoc you go, the more clay soils you have. But what it tells us also is that because more Merlot is being planted perhaps than Cabernet Sauvignon, that there is more of a move to actually have more forward styles of wine, because with Merlot you get slightly softer, more approachable wines. With Cabernet, with their big powerful wines, lots of tannin, if you had a wine 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, it would take years and years and years to soften. So by adding Merlot, you're softening the wine and allowing it to be more drinkable. And perhaps this is the way all wines are going, allowing these wines to be more accessible in youth. This wine is about 50% Cabernet and about 40% Merlot, with a little bit of Cabernet Franc and a little bit of Petit Verdot. Now, anyway, I hope you enjoy this wine, because I know I certainly will. Cheers. One of the more popular areas of the Bordeaux region for the British market has always been Saint-Emilion. And Saint-Emilion, of course, has a great rich history and wines that I'm sure we all know well. They're made predominantly from Merlot with a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon, and they grow also Cabernet Franc. The reason for that is that the Saint-Emilion region, which is to the right-hand side of the Gironde estuary, opposite the Medoc, has clay soils. And clay, being very damp, allows the Merlot's roots to be kept nice and wet, which is what Merlot really likes. And this is why Merlot does so well in this region. And the same with Pomerol, tiny little region just to the north of Saint-Emilion. But just outside Saint-Emilion and on the hill, you have the region called the Montagne de Saint-Emilion. And this little region produces wines a little bit lighter in style than Saint-Emilion itself, but again uses predominantly Merlot. So let's look at this wine. This is actually made by a producer called Chateau Gachon, and they're a classic old-fashioned Montagne de Saint-Emilion producer. And in the glass, let's see what it's like. Lovely deep colour, actually, look at that. And on the nose, hints of cherry and spice, real softness there. I'm actually picking up some raspberry as well. And the important thing is not to worry too much about what the textbook tells you. If it tells you it smells of raspberries or blackcurrants, and you don't get any of that, but you smell something completely different, it doesn't matter. As long as you like it, that's the important thing. Now on the palate, lovely, rich and soft. Not that heavy actually, quite light, but still that richness there coming through, which is lovely. This is what we would call a medium-bodied Saint-Emilion or Montagne de Saint-Emilion. This is absolutely delicious. My mouth's watering, there's lots of acidity, and again that vein of acidity really necessary to really balance the fruit and give it structure. That's a super well-made wine, it really is. The producer, Chateau Gachon, is actually very close to the borders of Montagne de Saint-Emilion, right on the border with Pomerol. And when I tell you, it's only 400 metres away from the famous Chateau Petrus, where of course the wine of Chateau Petrus will cost a lot more than Chateau Gachon. Pomerol, a different story for another time, but Gachon certainly worth looking at. Saint-Emilion has a lovely history, it really does. The Romans, of course, first arrived around the area of Saint-Emilion and grew their vines there. And in fact, so popular were the wines of Saint-Emilion in Rome itself that it caused great problems with the Roman winemakers. It was a massive bit of competition. But as most senators in Rome owned wine estates in Saint-Emilion, it was never going to be a problem. Even when the wines were banned in Rome, the senators won through. Britain, of course, has had a love affair with Bordeaux for a very, very long time. 1152, when Eleanor of Aquitaine marries Henry II and brings with her an entire estate of Aquitaine, which of course included Bordeaux as her wedding dowry. Not a bad wedding gift, I have to say. We held on to Bordeaux for 300 years and lost it at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, when a very old Captain Talbot fell off his horse, the final charge. We lost Bordeaux, but of course spent many, many years after that still in love with this wine and got hold of it any way we could, even if we had to smuggle it. The 1600s, wine was still very popular from this region in London. And one lovely story I really enjoy is the one about James I of Scotland, or James VI of England. And when we were obviously having a few, shall we say, disagreements with France, wines were actually quite difficult to get hold of. And he knew that all these wines were going up into Scotland and being drunk up there with great gusto. So to allow them to flow into England, he basically told the chieftains in Scotland that they were only allowed to have 4 tons of Bordeaux a year. This meant only a mere 5,000 bottles per household, which maybe doesn't sound a lot, but when only a few of them were actually drinking wine, it's quite important. They must have been permanently sloshed up there. Anyway, it meant that the London markets could have wine. Wines in those days were much lighter than they are now. And in fact, most of the wines came from Saint-Emilion and the Graves region to the south of Bordeaux. And these wines were called claret because of their light colour, the Latin for clear, and of course, which is where claret got its term from. But then in the late 1650s, 1660s, the Dutch came along, realised the value of the Medoc, which at the time on the left-hand side was just a marshy area, and they drained the marshes and allowed vineyards to be planted, which of course the British moved in with great gusto and set up these properties. The Medoc really took over, and poor old Saint-Emilion really fell out of favour for a while. But then, probably by the 1960s, 1970s, Saint-Emilion was back with great force, and now we're seeing Saint-Emilion very firmly positioned again in the market. I hope you enjoy this wine. I certainly do. Cheers. Ah, delicious. I'm a big fan of the commune of Margaux in the Medoc, and not least Chateau Rauzan Segla. I'd love to say that I could afford to drink Rauzan Segla all the time, but I can't. And often the second wine is the way forward, and I'll explain later what second wine means. We are up in the Haut Medoc, and there are 4 main communes, and communes are quite simply areas around small villages or small towns that are designated good enough to provide quality grapes, and providing you stick to the rules and regulations, you can put the commune name on your bottle label. The big communes that we know are Saint-Estèphe, way up in the north of the Haut Medoc, which produce very big, powerful, steely wines like Cos d'Estenel. And then you move down to Pauillac, the big, muscular wines like Le Tour, Lafite and Mouton. And then you get down to slightly softer wines in the commune of Saint-Julien, and really perfumed and almost scented wines in Margaux. And then of course you get to the town of Bordeaux itself, or the city. And beyond that you have Haut down in the Graves region, but we're not going to talk about that now. The Haut Medoc produces big, powerful wines, yes, but actually have a lot of finesse and balance to them as well. Predominantly made from Cabernet Sauvignon, with some Merlot, although we're seeing more Merlot planted. The wine I'm going to show you now is Rauzan Segla's second wine, Segla. As I said, it's a second wine. And Rauzan Segla itself was actually classified as a second growth in 1855. Basically the system that was set up to try and accord some kind of price order to these wines, which at the time were in complete chaos. So Rauzan Segla, second wine. Let's look at the wine in the glass. Lovely, deep, opaque colour. On the nose, that lovely scented cassis, blackcurrant, and slight strawberry aromas as well. That's smells wonderful. Let's taste it. Some real depth there. That's a super wine. My mouth's watering. There's lovely acidity there. Good ripe blackcurrant fruit. A little bit of a tannic edge to it as well. Still showing some signs of youth. That will really develop. But you know what? I'd happily drink this wine now. That really has quite a finish to it. I think you'll enjoy that. So Segla, second wine, what does that mean? Well, quite simply, back until probably the 1980s, you could only buy the main wines from these properties, and they were getting more and more expensive. And somebody came up with the idea of, well, why not start producing second, even third, even fourth wines from these properties? And what it meant was that these wines, which were slightly younger in style, were more approachable in their youth. They're wines that came from cuvées that perhaps came from vines that were much younger than the main wine, or perhaps from barrels that hadn't matured quite the same way as the main wine, and therefore weren't considered quite good enough to make the first wine. This is where these wines come from. But what they do importantly is give you a flavour and an idea of the style of the main wine, but of course at half the price. Also, these wines are much more approachable in their youth. You can actually drink them while you're still alive. And the reason I say that is because I used to do a lot of wine broking years ago. And I'd get an old chap ring up, 80 years old, and say he wanted to put down a case of Rauzan Segla just for a few years, and then he'd drink it. And then I'd look at the vintage and think, it's not going to be ready for 30 years. And I'd have to break the news to him that he probably wouldn't make it to see the wine. Usually it got quite a few laughs, but I have to say it made the point that actually second wines are not a bad idea. So I hope you enjoy this second wine. I must just tell you though, there is some great history, of course, around this wine. The winery has been owned by Chanel for a few years now. It's been around since 1661. It survived everything. Bordeaux has every possible disaster thrown at it that you can imagine. Certainly the French Revolution didn't do much for the Bordeaux industry, although unlike Burgundy, it didn't quite decimate it as much. The Bordeaux area, of course, had been controlled by the British many centuries before, and because of that, it wasn't Catholic, it was Protestant. And the Revolution, although they didn't really get on with religion very well, they certainly didn't really mind the Protestants too much. And for that reason, they didn't seize all the estates like they did in Burgundy. So most of these estates remained intact, which is why to this day we still see estates in Bordeaux much bigger than those in Burgundy. It of course survived phylloxera, which was this vine louse that infected vine roots back in the late 1880s, devastated Bordeaux and indeed the vineyards of France. 95% of vineyards were destroyed, but it survived. It survived World War I, it survived the Great Depression, it survived World War II, and of course the oil crisis of 1973. Many properties had spent huge amounts of money investing in new equipment to try and supply the huge demand that had started up again in the 1960s for the wines of Bordeaux. The oil crisis came along and suddenly the money wasn't there anymore. And of course a lot of them went bankrupt, which is why a lot of the banks and insurance companies moved in to buy up these properties and now own many, many properties in Bordeaux. But Chanel have done a really good job here, and I think Segla is quite a wine. Not only that, Segla was one of the first Bordeaux properties to actually use the Stelvin enclosure, the screw top. Can you imagine a few years ago saying to a Bordeaux producer, why not use a screw top? They'd think you were insane. But Segla had the idea, mainly to try and avoid cork taint. Big problem with all wines under cork. But of course, using the Stelvin enclosure, this is very, very unlikely to happen. Really innovative ideas, and I think you'll find this wine is certainly very enjoyable. Cheers.